The architecture of a built on a foundation of well-crafted silence. For 7 years, my life within the iron gates of the Sterling estate in the historic district of Boston was an envy to many. My husband, Julian Sterling, was a brilliant hedge fund manager whose cold, calculating mind was celebrated on the front pages of financial magazines. I, Clara, had dedicated my life to maintaining the pristine elegance of our home. We were a modern power couple, flawless, untouchable, and completely hollow. The first fracture in our false truth didn't come from a market crash or an anonymous affair. It arrived in the back of a black town car on a foggy Tuesday morning, wrapped in a faded wool coat and a heavy, suffocating silence. Her name was Martha. She was 55 years old, possessing sharp, analytical hazel eyes that contrasted sharply with her deeply lined, weathered face. According to the elite domestic agency Julian had hired, Martha was a premier medical caregiver with one unique characteristic that made her perfect for our specific household: she was completely mute, the result of a severe childhood illness that had destroyed her vocal cords. "She's perfect for Mother, Clara," Julian had whispered to me that morning, his fingers typing furiously on his phone as he prepared to leave for Wall Street. "She is highly trained, discreet, and most importantly, she won't chatter. Mother's condition requires absolute tranquility. No noise. No unnecessary distractions." My mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling, was the matriarch of the family fortune. 6 months ago, a massive stroke had left her entirely bedridden and completely paralyzed on her right side. She lived in the secluded east wing of our mansion, a sterile environment where the only sounds were the rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock and her own shallow breathing. As she stood in our grand foyer, her hands neatly folded in front of her. There was no warmth in her posture, but there was an undeniable, terrifying intelligence in her gaze. When I extended my hand to welcome her, she didn't smile. She simply gave a slow, measured bow, her eyes lingering on the heavy diamond ring on my finger for a fraction of a second too long. I thought I was hiring a shadow to care for a dying woman. I had no idea I had just invited the executioner of my family's darkest secrets into our home. Within 3 weeks, Martha had integrated herself into the daily rhythm of the estate with a terrifying efficiency. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the polished hardwood floors. To Julian, she was the ideal employee. Victoria's medical vitals stabilized under her care, and the east wing remained as quiet as a tomb. But as the days bled into weeks, a cold, uneasy feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. An active investigation wasn't my intention at first, it was born from small, jarring anomalies that disrupted the symmetry of my daily routine. Martha was a meticulous worker, yet she possessed habits that defied clinical logic. It started with the trash. One afternoon, while passing the service entrance, I noticed Martha emptying the waste bin from Victoria's suite. My eyes caught something unusual in the plastic bag. I waited until she returned upstairs, and then, driven by an instinct I couldn't yet define, I opened the bin. Inside were dozens of tiny, shredded pieces of paper. They weren't medical receipts or packaging. When I spread a few pieces across my palm, I realized they were fragments of old financial documents from Julian's private study, papers that should have been locked away in his personal shredder. Wasn't just throwing things away, she was actively scavenging. The second anomaly was her physical movement. One morning, as I walked down the East Gallery, I caught a glimpse of Martha through the half-open door of the library. She was standing by the fireplace, holding an expensive, antique porcelain vase that had belonged to Julian's late father. She wasn't dusting it. She was turning it over in her hands, tracing her thumb along the bottom rim, searching for a specific mark or stamp with the intensity of a seasoned appraiser. When she heard my footsteps, her posture changed instantly. She placed the vase down with perfect grace, turned to me, and bowed, her face returning to that flat, unreadable mask. "Is everything all right, Martha?" I asked, my voice echoing in the large room. She nodded once, her expression entirely vacant, and pointed toward the east wing, signaling it was medication. I watched her walk away, her back perfectly straight. A mute caregiver from a high-end agency shouldn't be hunting through a master's private shredded documents. A clinical nurse shouldn't be inspecting the authenticity stamps of 50-year-old family heirlooms. The false truth of our peaceful household was beginning to peel at the edges, revealing the first glimpses of a hidden, calculated architecture underneath. The atmosphere in the Sterling estate at 2 a.m. was not merely quiet, it was heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I couldn't sleep. The image of those shredded documents kept flickering behind my eyelids. I told myself it was just stress, that I was being paranoid, but my intuition, the internal compass that had guided me through years of corporate charity galas, was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I rose from the bed, wrapping a silk robe around me. The hallway was plunged in darkness, a faint, moonlight-bathed floor leading to the east wing. As I approached Victoria's suite, I expected to see the faint, steady glow of a nightlight that Martha kept on for the medical monitors. Instead, the door was cracked open just an inch. I froze. A soft, rhythmic sound reached my ears. It wasn't the sound of a medical machine. It was a repetitive, deliberate scraping, the sound of skin brushing against skin in a complex, rapid pattern. I crept closer, my heart drumming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't push the door, I leaned into the sliver of space, my eye pressed against the frame. What I saw shattered my understanding of reality. Martha was standing by the bedside, but she wasn't attending to Victoria's four. Her hands were moving in a blurred, violent, and highly intricate series of signs. They weren't the basic gestures of someone kneading a glass, they were the precise, tactical movements of someone engaged in a high-stakes, coded negotiation. And then, I saw the impossible. Victoria, the woman who had been declared completely paralyzed by 3 independent neurologists, was sitting upright in her bed. Her right hand, the one that was supposed to be withered and useless, was mirroring Martha's movements with equal speed. They weren't just communicating, they were arguing. Victoria's face, usually vacant and droopy from the stroke, was twisted into an expression of raw, unadulterated fury. She slammed her hand down on the quilt, a silent, thunderous gesture, and glared at Martha. Martha's composure cracked. For the first time, she didn't look like a submissive nurse. She pointed a sharp, accusing finger at the antique vanity mirror across the room, then tapped her own temple, her eyes flashing with a cold, terror. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene. Victoria wasn't paralyzed. And Martha, the mute caregiver, was fluent in a language of conspiracy. Suddenly, Martha spun around toward the door. I didn't wait. I retreated into the shadows of the hallway, my breath hitching in my throat, and sprinted back to my room just as the lock on the east wing door clicked open. The next morning, I didn't act like a frightened wife. I acted like a woman under siege. While Julian was at the firm and Martha was in the kitchen preparing Victoria's special liquid diet, I went to work. I had 2 targets, the shredded documents in the trash and the room where the truth was being hidden. I didn't have the sophisticated gear of a private investigator, but I had a high-end smartphone and a burning desperation. I started with the trash. I gathered the bags I had seen Martha emptying the day to the laundry room, where I had enough privacy to work. I spent 2 hours on the floor, my fingers aching as I pieced together the shredded strips of paper like a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal. By noon, I had managed to reconstruct a single, devastating page. It was a bank ledger, dated 3 years before I married Julian. It listed an offshore account in the Cayman Islands held under a name I didn't recognize, Elias Sterling. Elias? Julian had no brother named Elias. The entire Sterling family tree was documented in the library's archives. I had memorized it for the foundation gala. There was only Julian. But it was the entry at the bottom of the ledger that made my blood run cold: disbursement for the nanny's silence, $500,000. I didn't stop there. I walked into the library and searched for the hidden panel I had seen Julian use whenever he thought the house. I didn't have a key, but I knew the floorboards under the mahogany desk were loose. I pried them up with a letter opener, and there, nestled in a velvet-lined compartment, was a set of miniature digital cameras and a tablet linked to a home security feed I didn't even know existed. I swiped through the files. The feed wasn't of the front door or the garage. It was a direct feed into the East Wing. My pulse spiked. Julian wasn't just observing Victoria, he was monitoring her. I quickly navigated to the playback from the previous night, between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. The screen flickered, showing the high-definition footage of Martha and Victoria. But as I watched, I realized something even more horrific. There was an audio track, and it was playing at a very low, muffled volume. I plugged my earbuds in, turning the gain up to maximum. A voice, sharp and bushed from the static. It was Martha. She wasn't mute. "If you don't give me the authentication codes for the vault, Victoria," she whispered, her voice cold as a blade, "I will tell your precious son exactly who his real father is. And I will make sure the whole world knows that the Sterling fortune was built on a pile of stolen identities." Victoria's reply came in a raspy, strained voice that cracked with fear: "You wouldn't dare. Julian would kill you." "Julian?" Martha let out a dark, hollow laugh. "Julian doesn't know his own name, let alone his lineage. He's just a puppet, Victoria. And I'm the one pulling the strings." I ripped the earbuds out, my entire world tilting on its axis. The false truth wasn't just a secret, it was a war. My husband was a pawn, my mother-in-law was a fraud, and the mute nurse was the architect of it. I was no longer the lady of the house. I was an intruder in my own home, and I had exactly until dinner time to find out what Julian's true name was before the execution began. The air in the library felt thin, suffocating. I sat on the floor, the tablet still glowing in my lap, displaying the looped video of Martha's chilling confession. "Julian doesn't know his own name." The words played over and over in my head. I had lived with Julian for 7 years. I knew the way he took his coffee, the specific, obsessive way he arranged his pens, the way his jaw tightened when he lied about business deals. But I realized now, with a nauseating clarity, that I had never truly known him. I needed to move. If Martha and Victoria were playing a game of brinkmanship, Julian was the prize they were both fighting to control, or destroy. I decided to take the risk. I knew Martha would be busy with the afternoon infusion in the East Wing. I bypassed the main staircase, taking the servants' passage that ran behind the walls of the mansion, a relic of the house's Gilded Age design. It led directly into the service closet connected to Victoria's suite. I didn't have a plan, only a desperate need to hear more. I pressed my ear against the plaster, holding my breath. "The vault code, Victoria." Martha's voice was lower now, devoid of the theatrical anger she had shown the night before. "The firm is closing the merger on Friday. If we don't transfer those assets to the offshore account before the audit, Julian's entire corporate house of cards falls. And when it falls, you fall with it." There was a pause, followed by the clinking of metal. "A tray. You were always so arrogant, Martha," Victoria's voice rasped. "You think you're the puppet master. A ghost from a past that was buried 30 years ago. If I give you those codes, you'll kill me. I'm the only thing keeping you from a prison cell. I am the only thing keeping you from a murder charge, you pathetic old witch," Martha shot back. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Murder charge? My mother-in-law, the woman who spent her days being spoon-fed broth and staring at the ceiling, had killed someone. I shifted my weight, and the floorboard beneath me gave a tiny, agonizing creak. In the suite, the voices stopped instantly. "Did you hear that?" Victoria whispered. "Stay here," Martha commanded. I didn't wait. I turned to retreat, but as I reached for the door handle of the servants' passage, the light from the suite spilled across the floor. Martha hadn't gone for the door, she had gone for the intercom button that Julian had installed for us. She pressed it, and a piercing alarm began to wail throughout the entire mansion. I bolted. I scrambled through the narrow, dusty passage, my lungs burning, until I burst out into the back hallway near the kitchen. I didn't stop until I reached the main foyer, trying to compose my face, trying to scrub the terror from my eyes. A moment later, the front door swung open. Julian walked in, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his face flushed with the kind of high-octane irritation that only a bad day on the trading floor could produce. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "Clara? What the hell is going on?" "My phone just got a security breach notification from the East Wing." He looked past me, his eyes locking onto the figure standing at the top of the grand staircase. It was Martha. She wasn't wearing her uniform anymore. She had changed into a sharp blazer. She held a small piece of paper in her hand, a copy of the bank ledger I had reconstructed. The grand foyer felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written in blood. Julian didn't move toward me. He stayed by the door, his eyes darting between Martha on the stairs and me, standing by the hallway exit. His hand moved toward his pocket, a reflex, perhaps, but it was enough to make Martha laugh. "Don't even think about it, Elias," Martha said, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. His face, usually a masterclass in composed arrogance, went sheet white. "How?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "How do you know that name?" "I know the name because I gave it to you when you were 6 years old, sitting in the back of a van while your real mother was dragged away to the precinct." Martha descended the stairs, each step deliberate, predatory. "And I know the name because I've been the one paying the private investigators to keep your Sterling life safe from the truth for 30 years. I stood in the center, my hands trembling. "Julian? What is she talking about? Who is Elias?" Julian didn't look at me. He looked at Martha, his breathing shallow. "You're supposed to be dead, Martha. The accident in '96. The car went over the cliff." "The car went over the cliff, Julian. But I wasn't in it." Martha reached the bottom step. She ignored him and turned her piercing gaze to me. "Clara, you've been digging. Why don't you tell your husband what you found in the library? Tell him about the ledger." I held my ground, though my knees felt like water. "I know about the Cayman account, Julian. I know you aren't a Sterling. I know about the nanny's silence payments." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "Clara, listen to me," Julian finally spoke, his voice dropping to a seductive, desperate whisper. He took a step toward me. "Everything I've done, every lie, every penny stolen, was for us. To keep this life. To keep you." "Don't you dare," Martha hissed. "She's not your accomplice, Julian. She's your insurance policy. And unfortunately for both of you, I've decided the policy is no longer worth the premium." Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic tapping echoed from the East Wing gallery. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. It was the signal. Victoria was coming. But it wasn't the slow, dragging sound of a stroke victim. It was the firm, authoritative heels. The double doors to the East Wing swung open, and Victoria Sterling stepped out. She wasn't wearing her hospital gown. She was draped in a silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. She held a small, black revolver in her hand. It wasn't pointed at Martha. It was pointed at me. "Martha is right about one thing," Victoria said, her voice steady and chillingly calm. "The truth is a ghost that needs to be laid to rest. But she's wrong about who's going to be the one to bury it." Victoria looked at her son, or the man she had raised as her son. "You were always a failure, Elias. I pulled you from the gutter, I gave you a name, a legacy, and a company. And you let a mute nurse turn you into a frightened little boy." Julian looked at the gun, then at his mother, his fear to a dark, twisted realization. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew she was alive all this time." "Of course I knew," Victoria said, pointing the weapon toward the foyer. "I'm the one who's been paying her to stay mute for 20 years. But she got greedy. And you, Clara. She locked eyes with me, you were just the final piece of the puzzle. You provided the social standing, the clean reputation, and the perfect alibi for the company's final liquidation." Martha's triumphant smile vanished. She looked at Victoria, her eyes widening. "You didn't. You wouldn't kill us both here. The security system is mine, Martha," Victoria interrupted, a thin, cruel smile playing on her lips. "I've been watching you watch me for 6 months. Did you really think I didn't know?" The foyer felt like I was trapped between a fraud, a blackmailer, and a cold-blooded matriarch who had spent years acting like an invalid just to watch the rats devour each other. And then, I realized something. My phone. When Martha started the alarm in Chapter 4, I hadn't just sprinted away. I had left my phone inside the servants' passage, recording. And it wasn't just recording audio, it was connected to the cloud-based live stream for my charity foundation's gala organizers. The entire room, the entire conversation, was currently being broadcast to the board of directors of the Sterling Foundation. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3 p.m. The police weren't coming because Julian or Martha called them. They were already on their way, because I had given the world a front-row seat to the collapse of the Sterling Empire. She looked at Julian, then at me, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "Julian," Martha said, her voice clear, articulate, and terrifyingly calm. "I think it's time we had a family meeting. There's a ghost in this house that needs to be laid to rest. And Clara, she's been doing quite a bit of investigating today." Julian froze. He looked at Martha, then slowly turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were no longer the eyes of the man I had married. They were cold, dead, and utterly devoid of anything resembling love. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Tell me you didn't go into the East Wing." The false truth was dead. The confrontation had begun, and I realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that Martha wasn't the only one who had been hiding a voice. Julian hadn't been surprised by Martha. He was terrified of her. The room seemed to vibrate devices. Julian, no, Elias, stared at the live stream icon on my phone, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man watching his own funeral. "You idiot," he snarled at me, lunging forward. But Victoria was faster. Bang! A single shot fired into the floorboards near Elias's feet, sending splinters flying. "Sit down, Elias. The police are already tracked to the GPS of your precious phone, Clara. But that doesn't mean I can't finish this before they arrive." Martha, seeing her leverage evaporate, abandoned all pretense of the mute nurse. She stood tall, her voice losing its edge and becoming something else, a mother's voice, raw and trembling with suppressed rage. "You think you won, Victoria? You think you own this family?" Martha walked toward the center of the room, ignoring the gun. Elias isn't just a gutter rat you pulled up. He is the son of the man you murdered 30 years ago, the Real Arthur Sterling. The mansion went deathly silent. My husband, Martha continued, her eyes fixed on the man we all called Julian. He was the true heir. You killed him, staged the car accident, and kidnapped his son to manipulate the board. You needed a Sterling heir to keep the voting power, so you turned a 6-year-old child into your pawn. Elias, my husband, stumbled back, clutching his head. The weight of the lie, the sheer architecture of his stolen life, seemed to be crushing him. I remember a blue van. I remember being cold. I remember a woman who smelled like lavender. That was me, Elias, Martha sobbed, taking a step toward him. I didn't rush. I was thrown clear, and I spent 20 years in the shadows, watching you grow into a monster that she created. I didn't come here for the money. I came here to see her lose everything. Victoria's hand shook, just for a second. That was the crack in the armor. You're both pathetic, Victoria spat, though her gaze flickered toward the windows. Sirens began to wail in the distance, faint at first, then growing into a deafening chorus. The game is over, Victoria, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The board of directors is watching the stream. The police have the ledger. And I have the video of you confessing to the kidnapping 30 years ago. Victoria's cold, calculated mask finally shattered. She dropped the gun. It clattered on the marble floor like a death knell. She turned, her face twisted of pure, unadulterated hatred. She looked at the police lights flashing through the grand windows. You think you've won? You think that a family can exist after this? I built this empire. I turned this pathetic boy into a titan of industry. She turned to Elias, her voice dripping with acid. And you were just a tool. A warm body to occupy the seat of power until I could finish the consolidation of the firm. Elias looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't look like a CEO or a criminal. He looked like a broken child. I never loved you, he whispered. I was just waiting for the day I could destroy you, too. Crash. The front doors were kicked off their hinges. SWAT teams swarmed the foyer, their laser sights painting the room in red dots. Drop the weapons. Get on the ground. Victoria didn't fight. She smoothed her silk robe, lifted her chin with a chilling sense of pride, and knelt on the floor. She wasn't defeated, she was simply waiting for her next move, a legal battle she had been preparing for since before I was born. Elias, however, just stood there. He watched them put the cuffs on him. As the officers pulled him toward the door, he looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes. Only a hollow, terrifying emptiness. You were the only real thing in this house, Clara, he said softly. That's why I had to lie to you more than anyone else. As the police led Elias and Victoria away, I stayed in the foyer, feeling the cold marble beneath my feet. Martha was still there, sitting on the bottom step, staring into space. The chaos had died down, replaced by the hum of forensic teams processing the library. Over to her. It's over, Martha. You can stop playing the mute nurse now. She looked up at me, but her eyes weren't filled with the relief of a mother who had reclaimed her son. They were filled with a cold, terrifying calculation. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one she had been searching for in the library earlier. You think the police took them, Clara, she whispered, her voice no longer trembling. You think Elias and Victoria are going to prison for 30 years? My heart stopped. What do you mean? The ledger you found? The one you reconstructed, she chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. I left that for you to find. I needed a witness to the argument between me and Victoria. I needed someone to record the confession and broadcast it to the board, because I couldn't legally hold that evidence myself. The world tilted. What are you talking about? Victoria isn't going to jail for murder. She's going to jail for tax evasion and corporate fraud, crimes she can plea bargain her way out of in 18 months. And Elias? He's not going to jail at all. He's a victim of kidnapping, remember? He was just a pawn in his mother's game. She stood up, smoothing her blazer. You weren't the investigator, Clara. You were the catalyst. I didn't want to destroy the Sterling Empire. I wanted to cleanse it. I needed Victoria out of the way, and I needed Elias to be so broken that he'd sign the power of attorney over to the only person he trusts now, his mute nurse. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and secrets. Thank you for the live stream, darling. It made the board meeting very, very short. Now the majority shareholder of Sterling Holdings. I realized then that I hadn't saved anyone. I had just traded one monster for a more patient, more dangerous one. 3 months later. The Sterling estate was quiet. Too quiet. I sat in the sunroom, drinking tea. My divorce was finalized in record time, thanks to the legal team Martha, now the CEO, had hired for me. They had given me a settlement that would keep me in luxury for the rest of my life, provided I never stepped foot in Boston again. I looked at the newspaper on the table. Victoria Sterling pleads guilty to fraud, sentenced to time served. Sterling Holdings announces new CEO, Martha Sterling. Elias was nowhere to be found. They said he was in a private retreat for his mental health. I stood up and walked to the wall where the antique mirror. I touched the frame, remembering the day I first suspected something was wrong. I picked up a small tool I had kept, a specialized scanner I'd bought from a forensic supply store weeks ago. I scanned the frame of the mirror. It beeped. Hidden behind the glass wasn't just a listening device. It was a transmitter. I looked at the reflection. I saw myself, but I also saw the empty space behind the walls. I realized Martha hadn't just used me to get the company. She had used me to ensure that no one would ever look for the real Arthur Sterling's body. I turned the scanner toward the floorboards of the library. It screamed. The basement of this house wasn't a storage room. It was a tomb. And Martha hadn't been searching for documents, she had been searching for the one thing that could prove Elias wasn't who she claimed he was, the final piece of evidence that the real Elias had died and the person we knew as Julian was actually someone else entirely. I smiled at my reflection. Martha thought she had won. She thought she had turned me into a passive, wealthy exile. She didn't know that I hadn't just recorded the confession. I had copied the entire hard drive of the security system before the police arrived. I took a small, silver key from my pocket, the key to the private retreat where Elias was being held. I wasn't leaving Boston. I was just moving to the next level of the game. The Sterling Empire wasn't going to be run by Martha. It was going to be buried by the person she thought was just a pawn. The silence in the mansion was no longer a cage. It was my weapon. And I was just getting started.